In the heart of Sweden, there's this obscure family that owns industries worth billions, and they control a lot of what goes on in the world. But you've probably never heard of them. Over the course of 6 generations, the Wallenbergs have turned invisibility into a superpower. They grew their wealth and influence behind the scenes without ever being noticed. They helped save countless victims from Nazi Germany, but at the same time, they also helped Nazi Germany and banked for them. As wars waged and governments shifted, and while others were scrambling to survive, the power of the Wallenbergs only grew stronger, making them one of Europe's most powerful and discreet families. From AstraZeneca to Ericsson and many other companies on the Nasdaq, their influence spans industries that literally touch every aspect of our lives, but you'll never find them flaunting luxury yachts or flashing diamonds and being all over the news. In fact, you'll probably never even see their name on any rich list. That's because the Wallenbergs have perfected the art of staying invisible. Through a clever network of foundations, they keep their immense wealth hidden. But that brings up some interesting questions, like how does this family control so much power without anyone ever really noticing? Or how did 6 men who were bound by blood build a legacy that quietly runs the world? But most importantly, who are they really? The Wallenbergs are a really interesting family, but their rise to power was built on secrets, betrayal, and some pretty shocking decisions. You see, André Wallenberg got things started for the family in the early 1900s. He set the stage for everything that followed. When you think of Sweden today, you think of a pretty strong economy and a world leader in innovation, right? But rewind to the mid-1800s and you'd see a Sweden that was pretty far from this. The country was in a tough spot. It was full of potential, however, it was painfully short on money. You could say that the actual problem was that they had big ideas, but no way to fund them. And then came a man who would change everything. André Oscar Wallenberg, a young naval officer who just got back from the US, full of motivation and inspiration to make a big change. But what lit that fire in André? It comes down to a book called How to Start a Bank. And that book sparked an idea, and he started the Stockholm's Enskilda Banken, or SEB. I'm sorry for my pronunciation, but that was Sweden's very first private bank in 1856. Now, before SEB, it was really hard getting a loan from Stockholm because it would mean heading straight to the central bank. I mean, there was no competition, no creativity when it came to financing. It was a pretty bad way to grow an economy if you think about it. So André's thinking was different. He wanted to pool people's small savings and use that money to kickstart the economy. He was inspired by a model from Scotland, and the idea was simple: get the money circulating and watch Sweden grow. But here's the big question: can one bank truly change a whole country? Well, that answer didn't come from André alone. He needed someone to take that risk and really make it soar, and that person was his son, Knut Agathon Wallenberg. His son joined SEB and spearheaded the family's vision. He didn't just keep SEB local, he pushed it to international waters, and in very little time, it racked up a fortune. The real turning point came when a new law that restricted banks from holding too many industrial shares came in. So what did the family do? They created this thing called the Investor AB in 1916. It was a move that set the family's future in motion and solidified their lasting legacy in Sweden's economic history. And that's how SEB went global under Knut. Now, Knut and his wife, Alice, didn't just sit back and enjoy their wealth they had built. They had bigger plans for Sweden. Being childless, they decided to pour their entire fortune into the country's growth. They funded projects across Stockholm, including the development of the town Saltsjöbaden. Now, that wasn't all. They understood that the value of long-term impact. So in 1917, they created the Knut and Alice Wallenberg Foundation. This foundation was dedicated to push the boundaries in research, science, technology, and medicine. That's how their influence spread far beyond just banking. But that wasn't Knut's only focus. He also became deeply involved in Swedish politics. In fact, he served as Sweden's Minister for Foreign Affairs from 1914 to 1917. With this new role, the responsibility of the family business passed on to his half-brother. It was called Marcus Wallenberg Sr. Now, Marcus never believed in flaunting wealth or living a lavish life. Instead, he was driven by an almost obsessive need to build. Literally, he worked as an alcoholic. I mean, he didn't care much for luxuries. In fact, he was known to wear pocketless jackets, flipping them inside out when the fabric began to wear thin. For people like Marcus, it was all about reinvesting every single resource back into their ventures. His empire was his focus, and it consumed him. He was involved in pretty large companies like ASEA, which is now ABB, Norsk Hydro, Atlas Diesel, which is now Atlas Papco, Papyrus, Stora Kopparberg, which is now Stora Enso, Scania Vabis, which is now part of Volkswagen, and he steered some of these pretty big behemoth companies through some of their toughest moments. After World War I, the world was in chaos. In the midst of it all, Marcus stepped up and became Europe's go-to negotiator and arbitrator. But just when Marcus thought that his future was set, he hit a roadblock. He assumed that Nutt would pass down everything to him. After all, Marcus was the one who worked tirelessly to grow the family's fortune, but Nutt had other ideas. Before he passed away, he made a move that nobody ever expected. He put his entire fortune in a foundation. At the time, Marcus felt betrayed, but he wasn't seeing the full picture just yet, because little did he know that his decision was actually the family's greatest stroke of luck. It would turn out that without the foundation, the Wallenbergs' wealth would have been spread out and lost amongst multiple heirs. Eventually, it would have faded with time, but that foundation changed everything. It kept their riches intact, focused, and secured. But even with the fortune secured, the Wallenbergs' biggest test was yet to come, and it came in the form of one of history's darkest chapters. As the world braced for war, Marcus's legacy would be carried on by his two sons, Jacob Wallenberg and Marcus Dode Wallenberg Jr. I'm sorry for my pronunciation, but they were about to step into roles that would literally shape the family's future in ways that nobody could predict. Jacob Wallenberg was the one who truly carried the Wallenberg name forward. He inherited a heavy responsibility. In 1918, he joined SEB. In case you need a reminder, SEB was Sweden's first private bank that was established in 1856 by Andre Wallenberg. Now, Jacob quickly climbed the ranks of the bank and became vice CEO by 1920 and then CEO by 1927, a position that he held for 19 years. His leadership guided the bank through the trials of the Great Depression and the looming shadows of war. But what he didn't know yet was how deeply the family's role would run as the world around them shifted. Outside of Sweden, tensions were increasing. Now, even though Sweden stayed neutral, the Wallenbergs played a pretty dangerous game. They literally did business with both sides, with the Allies and the Axis. Jacob became one of Sweden's main trade representatives to Nazi Germany. Meanwhile, his younger brother Dode was working with the Allies. You see, Sweden was neutral on paper, but behind the scenes, the Wallenbergs were negotiating on both sides. And the plot only thickens from here because the Wallenbergs' connection to Nazi Germany ran deeper than just trade. SEB was one of the neutral institutions that cooperated with Nazi Germany. In fact, it was alleged that they helped launder looted assets from occupied territories, including from those of Jewish victims. Simply put, SEB is a dark chapter where financial transactions helped fuel both sides of the war. In many ways, Jacob Wallenberg became Sweden's go-to guy when it came to dealing with Germany during the war. Now, he handled exchange of goods between the two countries. On the surface, it seemed like a neutral position, but there was so much more happening beneath the surface. As the war continued, the Wallenbergs' involvement started to raise eyebrows. What had started as a strategic business move soon turned into a tangled controversy. The line between neutrality and complicity grew thinner. Now, the family's role in the war became very hard to ignore, but it's kind of strange because while they were helping the Nazis, the Wallenbergs were also secretly helping to plot Hitler's overthrow at the same time. It was a risky gamble for the family. I mean, they were juggling loyalty, survival, and morality. But here's how it went down. The main part of the German resistance was led by a group called Bleck and Gordeler, who were determined to overthrow the Nazi regime, and their goal was pretty clear. They wanted to implement some kind of coup d'etat to seize control of the government. But you know that they couldn't do it alone. They needed support from outside of Germany, particularly from England and the US, and that's where the Wallenbergs came in. The brothers acted as secret channels. They acted as intermediaries, passing messages between the resistance and the Allied forces. Jacob Wallenberg even met with the German resistance leader Karl Gordeler in 1943. It was their last meeting and Jacob's last trip to Berlin during the war. And it was his last trip because his involvement with the resistance had been exposed, and returning to Germany would have been a death sentence. And then came July 1944. The resistance launched their most ambitious plans yet. It was the infamous 20th of July plot to assassinate Hitler. Jacob Wallenberg was even asked to meet a messenger in Stockholm with the news of the coup's success. But as we all know from history, the plan failed. The bomb went off, but Hitler survived. The messenger was caught, jailed, and executed, and Gordeler, the German resistance leader, suffered the same fate just shortly after. Now, while Jacob Wallenberg was entangled in secret negotiations and resistance plots, his nephew Raoul was on an entirely different mission. Just like his uncle Jacob Wallenberg, he was clever, resourceful, and unafraid to take risks. While Hungary's Jewish population became the Nazis' next target in 1944, Raoul was tasked with an extraordinary assignment to go to Budapest and intervene. At the time, Hungary's 700,000 Jews were being deported to extermination camps, and Raoul's mission was to stop these atrocities. Once he was in Nazi-controlled Hungary, Raoul unleashed every trick in the book. He forged passports to declare Jewish individuals under Swedish protection, and the man literally pulled thousands from Nazi death trains. He intercepted Jews from being forced into death marches and rescued them in broad daylight. And in the final days of the war, the Nazis prepared to annihilate 70,000 Jews remaining in the Budapest central ghetto, and Raoul bravely stepped in. He negotiated and even threatened, and somehow he stopped the slaughter. We have to acknowledge this immense contribution here. The Wallenbergs had come out of Europe's worst moment stronger than ever, but as the dust settled, the carefully constructed image of the Wallenbergs began to crack. When the American troops uncovered documents in Stuttgart, they exposed something that haunted the Wallenbergs for years. These records showed that the SEB bank that belonged to the Wallenbergs had a dummy relationship with Bosch, a major German company. And actually, the Wallenbergs were helping the Nazis hide their assets. And this discovery was a bombshell. In 1945, the US Treasury officials blacklisted them, labeling the Wallenberg brothers as special blocked nationals. That's like getting put in the financial equivalent of a penalty box, only this time the stakes were global trust. And back at home, in Sweden, people were beginning to wonder what else were they hiding. Sadly, their reputation was shattered and their prestige was gone, and while this scandal brewed, something far more personal and heartbreaking was happening. The tragedy I'm talking about is the capture of Raoul by the Soviets. As I mentioned earlier, this young diplomat was only attempting to save people from Nazi camps, and this was in 1945. The Soviets had entered Budapest and Raoul was taken into custody. They accused him of being a spy, and just like that, he disappeared. For years, the Soviet Union denied knowing what happened to him, and decades later, they would claim that he had long died of a heart attack in 1947 when he was only 35 years old. But nobody knows the truth to this day. Meanwhile, the Wallenbergs focused on rebuilding their wealth and their prestige on the global stage. After the war, they were eager to rebuild their business ties, and surprisingly, this included dealings with the Soviets. In fact, they were planning to loan Stalin's regime a staggering $250 million. Now, I can't help but wonder, but could the Wallenbergs have used their influence to advocate for Raoul's release, or was it just a calculated risk to prioritize business over pressuring the Soviets for answers? These are questions that are unanswered, but we can only speculate. The Swedish government didn't help much either when it came to Raoul. They stayed silent. It's a tragic and frustrating and a pretty weird story. A man who saved thousands of lives was left abandoned by the very people who could have saved him. Around this time, Jacob considered stepping back. After all, he had built an empire and guided the bank through some of the most turbulent times in history. In 1946, he made the decision, and he stepped down from his role as CEO, and his resignation marked the end of an era. And with that, the baton passed on to his younger brother, Marcus Dode Wallenberg. Now, Marcus was about to take the reins of one of the most influential financial institutions in Sweden, but he wasn't just going to sit back and relax. He had a mission. Marcus was hands-on, reshaping the Wallenberg empire. He turned Atlas Diesel into Atlas Copco. He also played a major role in developing Sweden's Saab fighter jets and managed tricky trade deals during the war. Now, Marcus remained at the center of every major decision for 50 years, from 1930s until his death in 1982. But with all this power came huge pressure. The weight of the family's legacy wasn't easy to carry, and time was not being kind to his body. So Marcus had his two sons, Mark Wallenberg Jr. and Peter Wallenberg, and between the two sons, Mark was the one who was ready to step up. He was being prepared for the role from a very young age. Mark's education, his career, everything was designed to prepare him for this moment. Simply put, the job was to carry on the family's legacy. He worked hard to merge two major Swedish banks called Skandinaviska Banken and the SEB to create a new form of SEB that we know today. And the pressure was relentless. Everyone expected him to succeed. Then in 1971, something happened that nobody saw coming. At just 47 years old, Mark Wallenberg took his own life. It was heartbreaking and it was a huge loss for the family. A lot was riding on Mark. He had a legacy to continue and an empire to lead. The tragic death of Mark Wallenberg left a void in the family business. His brother Peter Wallenberg stayed out of the spotlight mostly, but suddenly he found himself in the hot seat. Peter had taken a different path, far from the traditional family footsteps. Instead of diving straight into the family business, he started at the ground floor of the Atlas Copco in Africa. There he worked his way up and slowly built his own career. His relationship with his father had been strained, and he knew that he had to forge his own future. But with Mark's sudden passing, Peter's path took an unexpected turn. The family needed him, and though he was not the chosen one, he stepped in and was determined to take on responsibility even if others doubted him. When Peter's father passed away in 1982, he stepped up as the head of the family business. Now, nobody thought that he was the right fit. There was a lot of doubt about him, but Peter stepped up. He wanted to prove everyone wrong. Over the years, he didn't just manage the business, but he took it to a global level. He pushed through major restructurings and even managed to buy back shares in Atlas Copco and Stora Kopparberg from Volvo. As a result, he secured the family's stake in those companies. He did all of this by launching Patricia Industries, which later became a crucial part of their investment company, Investor AB. And that was just the beginning of Peter's lasting impact on the family legacy. So the question is, where does the Wallenberg family stand today? Well, if you thought that their influence was huge before, just wait and see how far it really goes. The empire is now in the hands of the fifth generation. The brothers Jakob Wallenberg, Peter Wallenberg Jr., and their cousin Marcus Wallenberg. And the numbers are really jaw-dropping. According to the Financial Times, the Wallenberg business empire is valued at an estimated 250 billion euros. To put that into perspective, that puts them up there with the likes of Elon Musk when it comes to financial power. But unlike Elon Musk, you'll never hear much about the Wallenbergs on the news. And that's because much of their actual wealth is hidden. That's right, most of the Wallenbergs' empire's assets are locked away in foundations. This clever structure helps them avoid inheritance taxes and ensures that no one in the family can just dip into the funds for personal gain. Now, this isn't just a small change that I'm talking about. The foundations hold more than $30 billion in assets. They also have major stakes in publicly listed businesses, which together are worth over $660 billion. That's why you'll never see the Wallenbergs on any of the Sweden's rich lists. Their wealth is there, but it's kept within the family and managed through these foundations. Their control over Sweden's economy is unmatched in Europe. In fact, the historian Gunnar Waterberg, who had written excessively about the Wallenbergs' rise, says it best: every government, whether left or right, knows that they must work with the Wallenbergs. It's what's best for Sweden. Now, what really sets the Wallenbergs apart is how they've built and sustained their wealth across generations. There's this concept called the curse of the third generation. Essentially, it's this idea that the wealth created by the founders of successful companies are carried forward by their children, but then it starts to dwindle down by the time it reaches their grandchildren. But that was not the case with the Wallenbergs. Jacob, Marcus, and Peter, now in their late 60s, are still running the empire. They have already set things up for the sixth generation and will take over when the time comes. Now, passing on wealth is one thing, but passing on values is a whole other concept, and that's where the Wallenbergs really stand apart. These men don't live in the spotlight. They focus on running their businesses well, and it shows. They follow this family motto, which is Latin, and it means to be and not to seem. They're not out there to make noise and chase fame. Instead, they focus on what matters. They rarely give interviews, and when they do, it's always about business, their institutions, or their philanthropy. They keep their personal lives and politics out of the public eye. But despite all of this, their power, their influence, and their control is still very real. The Wallenbergs are seen as kingmakers, as the Financial Times often calls them. Another publication also calls them the best paid charity workers in the world. The mix of power and philanthropy makes them untouchable. Because if you go after the Wallenbergs, you're not just going after a family. No, you're going after Sweden itself, and very few would dare to do that. Now, after everything we've seen so far, the Wallenbergs family makes you pause and think. They're one of the most powerful families out there, and they've built an empire worth billions. But despite this, they stay under the radar, and they've perfected the art of passing wealth on through generations without losing a lot of it. Now, through wars, economic crashes, and some really dark times, they've held on to this wealth and power. Their ability to remain invisible while controlling companies like Ericsson, AstraZeneca, and Saab is nothing short of extraordinary. What's even crazier is that despite their massive influence, they've avoided being part of any rich list. They keep to themselves and they stay out of the limelight. And they've managed to use clever strategies like the foundation system to keep their wealth in the family. Now, having said all of this, they are financial geniuses, sure, but they're also shrouded with a very dark past, with helping Nazi Germany and turning a blind eye only to help their businesses grow. But having said that, in the end of the day, it's clear that the Wallenbergs are still the masters of discretion. Now, please do subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and put a $sign in the comments to show that you've made it till the end. Also, check out this video that I made about the Rockefellers. I think you'll really enjoy it. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you soon.